It is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. It's Congressman Rick Larson, who is the representative from the 2nd Congressional District in Washington State, the best state, coincidentally. He's serving his 5th term, and it's a pretty massive district that stretches up to that Canadian border, so he understands well some of those issues. It's also home to Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, sort of the emotional and physical home of the Navy EW community, and Naval Station Everett. He serves on the House Armed Services Committee and is also the co-chair of the EW the Electronic Warfare Working Group within the House, and so he's deeply steeped in these issues. He's been a great advocate for the broad capability nationally, and has really been a leader in the House in developing a broader understanding across all of the committees, the relevant committees, about the importance of the electronic warfare component of our national defense, and all the issues surrounding that. He's a graduate of Pacific Lutheran University, has a master's from the University of Minnesota, and again has been dedicated a lot of his time as a representative to developing a very deep understanding of a lot of the issues that we're talking about today, and discusses them frequently with his colleagues. So we're honored to have him here, and we look forward to his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to be here at CSIS. It's obviously a pleasure to come speak. I had the chance to say hello to John Hamre before I came in, and I've actually been in this room to speak on U.S.-China relations as well. And between U.S.-China and electronic warfare and just a few other issues, it leaves little time for other things, but those other things actually directly serve the district. And so trying to explain to people about U.S.-China relations, or trying to explain to people generally about electronic warfare, sometimes can be difficult, and especially electronic warfare. It's especially difficult. I've had an occasion to give tours of the U.S. Capitol to some of the men and women who serve at NAS Whidbey. And as we're walking through the Capitol, and we're all reminding ourselves about our oath of office, our oath to our country, and seeing some of the symbols of in the Capitol about why we take this oath and why we want to stand up for our country, I remind them that these men and women are as much symbols about electronic warfare as anything else, because you can touch and feel and push and prod a person, but you really can't touch, feel, push, and prod the spectrum. And so to try to help people understand what their job is and understand the importance of it, tell them they have to be their own ambassadors about this. And fortunately, they do that. And unfortunately, sometimes because of the nature of this world, this electronic warfare world, they're just not allowed to talk about some of the things that they do. But be that as it may, it's important that they're out there. And I want to start with that you can't touch the spectrum, you can't see it. The devices that manipulate it are a mystery to everybody but the technical experts. And I'll admit, they're even a mystery to me sometimes. I'm not a technical expert. I'm a member of Congress, so by definition, I'm not an expert on anything. But it is a challenge to explain electronic warfare to members of Congress, and sometimes not to all senior officials, but to some senior officials at the Department of Defense. But controlling the electromagnetic spectrum is essential to winning wars. It's essential to winning the battles in the battlefield. And as we've seen, of course, over the last couple of years, just how important it is to protecting our service members. So I want to thank CSIS for hosting this conference to help folks here in Washington, D.C. and and other folks understand the EW world and why it's important to this country to have some level of control over the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, broadly defined, electronic warfare is a fight to control who uses the spectrum, and how they use it. And I understand that the panel before me was an example of electronic warfare. But be that as it may, people in my district associate electronic warfare with airborne electronic attack. Very, simply put, the EA-6B Prowlers and now the EA-18G Growlers that are replacing the Prowlers, each carrying high-powered jammers that confuse and incapacitate enemy radar systems. And as a representative from Naval Air Station Whidbey Island in Washington State, where the Navy's Electronic Attack Wing is located, I'm a strong advocate for these capabilities, and that's actually where I started first getting involved in this issue. And then, of course, in those 10 years, it's obviously become a much bigger set of issues. Some folks associate EW with the work of JIATO, the Joint Improvised Explosive Device Defeat Organization, which was established during the Iraq War to defeat roadside bombs. But EW, as we know, is much broader, and the spectrum, as a result, is a much bigger debate. We use electromagnetic energy in a wide range of offensive and defensive weapon systems, including radars and ships, electronic countermeasures, helicopters, a variety of other things, just to give a few examples. And the most visible and publicized example of EW in the last few years, of course, has been this fight in Iraq against improvised explosive devices. Insurgents in Iraq build IEDs, which are detonated by simple devices like cell phones and garage door openers. This is a somewhat basic form of EW, but as we have seen, it's also tended to be a very effective form of electronic warfare. And as the military struggled to meet this threat, they've turned to the Navy, which has maintained the strongest longer-term investments in EW technology and personnel since the end of the Vietnam War. Now, many Navy electronic warfare officers from my district deployed with the Army and the Marine Corps to Iraq and Afghanistan to help deal with the spectrum. And nearly 250 technical experts from Naval Station Crane are currently working to support Marine Corps and Army jamming programs. And this is a success story. And we've made great progress in developing and deploying technologies that can defeat IEDs, and this has saved the lives of U.S. troops. But further, our military remains focused on this threat, and they've mobilized engineers to stay ahead of the new techniques that insurgents might develop, and the Army is as well as training EW experts to help win the ground EW fight. So in my view, the key issue, at least from a armed services perspective, is what happens after the clear and present threat of IEDs fade. What should we be doing to make sure we're focused on spectrum issues moving forward? So the Congressional EW Working Group, which I chair along with Representative Joe Pitts from Pennsylvania, we started looking at some of these issues in about 2008. We met with representatives from industry, and I understand you'll be talking to some industry folks later, from academia, and from the services, military services, to learn about what steps the Department of Defense should take to ensure that the department can continue to control the spectrum in the battlefield long into the future. And we published our findings in a report by the Association of Old Crows, a group that's made up of retired electronic warfare folks. It's entitled The Future of Electronic Warfare. And we recommended the Department of Defense focus on three key areas: training and readiness, technology, and leadership. On the readiness issues, we really concluded that EW capabilities, and this gets back to what I said at the beginning, EW capabilities are really human capabilities. You need to have smart, trained people who know what they're doing with it in order to do the right things with it. So we need to have a core group of highly trained individuals to help each service identify threats to the spectrum, develop and deploy solutions to these threats, and perhaps, I think most importantly, coordinate electronic warfare systems in the theater to make sure that we control the spectrum during those operations. There's been some progress on this issue. There are some examples of progress. The Army has established an EW training school. The Air Force announced the creation of a F-35 EW squadron. These are new organizations. They should yield long-term results as more people understand what EW is and why it's important. Second issue, though, is on technology and investment. And this is where maybe the next panel will be, a pretty good set of issues to discuss. We had a great set of issues to discuss a couple years ago when we put this report together with industry. So during times of war, our men and women in the field realize just how important it is to invest in the spectrum, and money usually pours into EW, frankly, in times of war. But during times of peace, EW is usually one of the first places that we cut. because it's not as visible as ships and planes and tanks. Believe me, it's a lot easier to go home and fight for a ship, right, or a tank or a plane than it is to fight for a wave, right? Again, people can't see it, they can't touch it, they can't feel it. But that does not mean it is less important, and of course, in many ways, as we know, it's sometimes more important. So we do need to move away from this feast or famine mentality that we have in EW. The military, I believe, does need a continuing, stable, coordinated investment in EW technologies, even if the overall defense budget is flat or declines in the future. Now, further, the department needs to make sure that it's on the same page with private industry. The EW hardware that we're developing today will be around for years, if not decades, but, and this is maybe the discussion, a theme you just touched on earlier, and one that you will have to touch on later today. Commercial technologies that use the spectrum evolve much more quickly than the Department of Defense evolves practically doing anything. And I think this is why the Secretary, and this is not my prepared remarks, but I think this is why the Secretary is really pushing hard on the department, both in terms of looking at what it ought to be doing and what it shouldn't be doing, as well as on efficiencies, because the department needs to find a way overall to move faster to keep up with the rest of the world. And this is especially true when it comes to electronic warfare and technology. So the military needs to work with private industry to make sure that we're making the right investments so that we can have high quality electronic warfare hardware as well as the software that can be upgraded when threats evolve. The final issue we looked at was leadership. And I think one of the most important things that we can take to improve our ability to control the spectrum is to improve EW leadership. Not that it's bad, it's really actually very good within the military services, at the joint level, and within the Office of Secretary of Defense. I think what the challenge we face is that it is, like much everything else, it's stovepiped in the department. And this is just not my view or the EW working group. The U.S. Strategic Command performed a capabilities-based assessment and determined that the lack of a unified EW leadership was the #1 problem facing the military's ability to control the spectrum. That is, not having one view from the DoD to kind of help shape what our response to EW will be and what our investment into EW will be. So creating a leadership structure for EW would create a more obvious career path for EW specialists and higher ranking leaders who would have then more clout when it comes to setting policy and fighting for resources. So a couple of things we might want to look at, and this we talked about in the report. Each service needs to have general or flag officer who focuses on EW. There should be a joint organization, and call it what you want. I have Joint Center of Excellence, but if I say that, then that's going to mean one thing to one group of people and one thing to another group of people. Frankly, I'm in the business of I don't care what you call things. Here's what you ought to do, is sort of my business. And so some level of a joint organization, so you do have an ability to coordinate across the services and advocate across the services for electronic warfare, not just for the money for one service, but the money for all the services, for the technologies and the hardware and the people that complement each other, not just for each individual service. Now, this type of leadership structure will ensure that as IEDs perhaps fade in the future, I think IEDs will be around for a long time, but I think they'll pop in and out of our lives over time. But I think senior policymakers need to be reminded of the importance continually of controlling the spectrum. So the department is focused on looking at the challenge of the EW investment, training, and leadership, and is conducting various studies on how it manages EW within the services. The services, I don't know why I have to write these things this way, but it's like the services and DoD. You're laughing because you know exactly what I'm talking about. Are seeking to define the relationship between electronic warfare and information operations. And they're working to create an enterprise that can handle the broader challenges of setting policy, researching new technologies, coordinating acquisitions, training experts to deal with both the electronic attack and the tough issue of how we use an increasingly congested spectrum ourselves. Now, these studies, if done on time, and I encourage strongly the department to finish these sooner rather than later, these studies will help and should help inform POM 12, the Program Objectives Memorandum for 012. And possibly even, if we finish sooner rather than later, we're going to begin to see some of the changes happen at the DoD over the next 18 months. As DoD continues to work to improve its capabilities and management structure in EW, I'm working to raise the awareness in Congress about the critical need for the spectrum. I sponsored an amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill that requires the department to submit an electronic warfare report to Congress each year for the next 5 years. Now, this law requires a report to include information about the department's strategy, its leadership structure, the EW programs that are the major ones that the department is working on. Now, of course, the report was due last February, has not yet been submitted, shockingly sometimes. But the fact that, and I certainly want to see it happen, but the fact that the department has stepped forward on the CBA and the capabilities-based assessment and the functional skills analysis, and looking at those kinds of things is an indication that the department is actually being responsive to Congress's concerns about electronic warfare. Having said that, I am speaking with Chairman Skelton and believe that this report, when submitted, would be an extremely great topic for an early hearing next year. I'd like to just conclude by talking a little bit about Afghanistan. And I just returned from CODEL to Afghanistan, where I got to meet with many of our troops, our military leaders, our civilians, who are doing a great job over there as well. And just a note about that, about Afghanistan, that the demand for EW capabilities in Afghanistan remains high, and that demand from both U.S. and NATO allies, so all of ISAF. General Cartwright, the current Vice Chief of Staff, during his confirmation hearing last year, noted that a lack of airborne electronic attack was a key deficiency in Afghanistan, and to meet this gap, the Navy is buying additional Growlers and will deploy them to Afghanistan in support of the war effort. And I think that's obviously good news because we still have good strong challenges over there in Afghanistan. But EW is saving lives in Afghanistan. In addition to the IED threat, we're using our electronic warfare devices in a variety of ways. Something that is very frustrating to the enemy and forcing them to change, which puts them more on the defensive. I think an area of improvement is cooperation with our allies on electronic warfare. We need to continue to focus our relationship with our NATO allies over there and other coalition allies on more of a need to share and less on a need to know, so that we can work with our partners to defeat IEDs. And cooperation with NATO is critical to our success in Afghanistan overall as well. And I hope that our partners in Europe will see that, and as the Lisbon conference comes up in November, that they are willing to dedicate additional resources to Afghanistan. I'd like to end there, and again thank CSIS for sponsoring this conference, and open to take some questions.
Great, thank you so much. Again, if I could just remind people to wait for the mic, and we'll get going.
Hello. Yes, John Chapin from MIT. Thank you for your remarks. I'm a technical guy, and I just wanted to make sure you were aware that
do this in English then. So at MIT, I'm already going, oh, I'm not going to get this right.
No.
It's not going to happen.
From a technical perspective, it would be highly desirable to design a single integrated system that performs both EW and comms, particularly in space and power-constrained ground units like a Humvee or something. You'd get much better deconfliction, you'd save a lot of space and power and so on. So that's a technically desirable thing. But it seems like we've got two completely separate acquisition structures and management structures and so on, and it gets very, very hard to actually see that happening. Do you agree that's desirable? Is the country moving in that direction at all?
Yes, two questions. The second one I don't know the answer to, if we're moving there. The first one is, in my opinion, not knowing all of what you know, it is certainly where we ought to be going in principle. Mark Middaugh works for me in the back. He's making notes on this. He'll make notes on everything you say. Maybe not who you are, but certainly what you say. But I do think that, see, I think if we do the right things on technology, it would probably do a lot to force the services to break down their own barriers. And actually in Afghanistan, what ended up happening is you had Navy officers showing up in some of these battalions and folks saying, why are what color uniform is that and why are you here? And then after they found out why they were here, they wanted more. They wanted more of our Navy folks, and then they wanted to find out, well, what for the Army is like, what do we need to know basically, so we can start doing this ourselves, and you guys can get back, whatever in your airplane and do what you're supposed to be doing, and that's what we ought to and we ought to be learning from each other. The services ought to be learning from each other on that. That I would count as a positive experience out of a very tough and difficult one. But it's that kind of attitude as well that needs to migrate into how we look at acquisition, especially in an era of tighter budgets, especially in an era of more congested spectrum. And whether it's your idea or someone else's, I don't know, but that's the principle I believe that we ought to be pushing towards. And I know there's going to be 9 out of 10 people will tell me why it can't happen, as well. But that's the way of the world in this job sometimes. Yeah.
Let's go way in the back, and then we'll come up here and go over there.
I have two things. First one is a point to the gentleman from MIT. OSD is working on the jammer and communications solution. But
could you introduce yourself?
I'm Tom Taylor, OSD NII Spectrum. I write policy and do programs. So we are working on that solution, but it's all R&D right now, and how to turn that into a capital investment for DoD is very challenging. We are trying to write roadmaps to that solution, so I'd be interested in talking to you later. Change subject completely, sir, to you. The political challenge of getting training ranges for electronic warfare inside the United States seem to be almost insurmountable. Do you see a way around that, or is there an approach we can take to get electronic warfare training inside the borders of the United States, even given the National Broadband Plan and the explosion of new technologies, given that these new technologies are actually what we're trying to jam against because they're creating the bombs that go boom?
Yeah, well, we have a challenge there, Tom, because the same technologies are the ones that are running our economy as well, running our economy. And these days, if you talk to any member of Congress right now, they'll tell you what's the #1 issue. Running the economy. It's the economy. Stupid or not, it's the economy. And when times are good, that same technology, actually, no, a very different technology will be running the economy because the technology will evolve. So I recognize, again, I recognize the political challenge. I didn't bring the solution for you today. I know you had a discussion about an element of that political challenge earlier about the use of the spectrum for defense purposes, for security purposes versus economic purposes. We are not there yet, I think, in the discussion. That is, we're not to a solution yet in the discussion about how best to allocate that spectrum. Now, Joe Pitts, Representative Pitts, and I did write a letter to the FCC saying that they absolutely need to consider the spectrum when they're looking at the allocation and reallocation of spectrum. And I'm sorry, they need to look at how defense uses it. But it would be very difficult and I think wrong to say order FCC to say this much has to go here. That's an inefficient way of allocating spectrum, and it's not a bad idea for the department. And you're all getting this from Secretary Gates and his efficiencies work. It's not a bad idea to think about how that applies to the spectrum as well. Solutions are going to be probably in a lot of things like John from MIT brought up, and the things that you guys are figuring out as well. But I don't have the I don't have the position paper for you on that one yet.
Let's go right here. He's coming from the other side, sneaking up on you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Barry Fell. I provide technical support to DARPA. And Rick, my question to you is, can you give us an assessment of Congress's awareness of the importance of EW? And anticipating your answer, what can the people in the EW community do to raise that awareness?
Yeah. Sure. Anticipating my answer to the first question, obviously it's relatively low, all right? In part because you're going through the things I talked about earlier, in part because you can't touch, you can't feel it. I would say that if you're on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over some of the over the FCC and the technology issues associated with that, have a higher level of awareness, but maybe not an awareness as it relates necessarily to the security needs or defense needs. And so, what I try to do, and what we've done in the past is we've had it. In the past, we've had EW days where we've brought folks in and provided forums and have those run by, sponsored by members of Congress and try to get other members of Congress or their staffs, right? Mainly the staffs in to learn about that. We had a good turnout when we put this report together a couple years ago from members of Congress, but it's like anything. I'll go back to the U.S.-China example. Here's an example, right? And this is a good story so you understand members of Congress, all right? I was in Beijing speaking to the AmCham, American Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, AmCham. And we spoke, with a colleague of mine, we spoke, and then there was questions from the audience, much like this. And of course, this was a couple years ago, but things weren't really great between U.S. and China. But they weren't bad, but there was some rigmarole going on. And this person, the question was basically this: well, you guys, right, members of Congress, we're also known as you guys. It's in the Constitution. You guys. You guys, you're in D.C. and you beat up on China, and then you come to China and you go around the country of China and you get religion about the U.S.-China relationship, and you're really great. And then you go back to D.C. again, and you get another religion, and you're back to where you were. And I said, well, you got a third of that wrong. I said the part you got wrong is there's only one person who represents Washington D.C., and that's Eleanor Holmes Norton. All the rest of us represent our own districts, and I go back to the 2nd District of Washington State, and that's where I get my religion. And Joan goes back to the 50,000th district of state X and gets his or her religion. The point is that if you want to get to a member of Congress on an issue, you've got to connect it to where they're from. Literally where they're from. If it happens in their district, then it happens to them and they care. And so the challenge is trying to find those connections, whether that's through industry or whether that's through academia or whether that's through, like for me, Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, or someone like Brad Ellsworth in Naval Station Crane, right? Something like in Crane, Indiana. You have to connect to their districts. So I don't know how many of you are interested in running a grassroots campaign. I'm going to encourage you to do that. Some folks in here wearing uniforms, you can't do that. I'll be clear about that. But to understand members of Congress is to understand their district. There's just no two ways around it. There's something going on in their district, they'll care about it much more than anything going on here in Washington, D.C. So that's how you do it. Yeah.
Let's go here and then we'll go.
I'm Mike Nelson at Georgetown University, and I was trained at MIT as a physicist, but I'm not going to ask you a technical question. I came to Washington a little over 20 years ago, and went to the Hill as a congressional science fellow. And so I'll ask you a political question instead.
Okay.
One of the first things I worked on was a bill to require the federal agencies to start coordinating better on high-performance computing research. And we discovered that the agencies were all eager to coordinate with each other. The problem was the Hill. It took us 3 years to get this bill passed because the committees that had jurisdiction over the different agencies couldn't get their act together and couldn't work together to encourage the agencies to work together. So my question for you is do you have hope that we can get the various agencies, the various committees that have oversight over intelligence, over DOD, over the FCC, can they work together better to coordinate in developing policies that will help us in addressing spectrum policy issues and electronic warfare issues?
Sure. Thanks. Well, let me start off by saying I don't mean to be defensive or anything, but I know there are no examples in the scientific community where universities battle each other for the right to say that you did it. So Congress is the only guilty party I know. So we'll just no. I'm actually reading The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes, and I was surprised about the amount of cooperation that was taking place among all these folks who didn't know what they were getting towards, but they knew what the next step was they were getting towards. But having said that, my confident I'm more confident on this set of issues because there are fewer committees to deal with it, right? And if you look at the 9/11 report, the Commission's report, and talks about intelligence, and we have practically implemented most of those recommendations except one major one, right? That is, Congress needs to reform itself and how it oversees intel, and because there are so many committees with jurisdiction, and I bring that up as an example of the problem you're underlining, and one that you could meet here. But I think when it comes to this set of issues with the spectrum, it is a more finite group of folks than on some other issues. I'd also note that as far as I can see, we're not, as far as where the DoD is going, they're not really. It's not necessary to have additional legislative authority to do a lot of what I think they ought to be doing and what they need to be doing, and that gives them a little more freedom. They may end up getting some oversight as they make decisions, but they don't need as much legislative authority to do what they ought to be doing, in my view, and need to be doing. So I don't see that as a major problem in this regard. In this one. Well, I'm here to talk. I'm here to talk about and all the spectrum. Well, I mean, but in spectrum, yeah, it's energy, commerce, it's us. It's going to be Intel. But again, from my assessment, the world of what needs legislative fixing is relatively smaller compared to what you can move forward on without legislative authority. Relatively, it's all relative.
Good morning, Congressman. Brian Hinckley, recently retired Navy captain, 27 years from your district.
Great.
From EA6B World. I'll tell you, first of all, thank you for your advocacy, because it's been tremendous, and you and Representative Pitts have been by far the leading advocates across the country, and it's helped us in DOD. The second point, I wanted to say that we're making great strides, I think, in EW and spectrum with the inextricable linkage between the two. And we've got spectrum experts and EW experts, and we're all sitting in the same conference together. So that's a good thing. And we weren't there.
And a great start. Yeah.
We weren't there a few years ago. And so we're moving in the right direction. My question is, I know you've been very helpful in mandating through amendment to make sure that the Department of Defense, the services, were held accountable to provide to the Congressional EW Working Group, or to provide to Congress, their EW slash, let me group in their electromagnetic spectrum operations, their strategy on an annual basis. So my question would be, have you had any progress in that, and would you be able to enforce that? Because I think it's an important part for DoD.
Yeah. I mentioned this in my talk, but I'll expand on it a little bit. No agency, no department likes Congress to tell it to do a report. None at all. And we love, just the opposite. We love to tell departments and agencies to do reports. But we did mandate the report, and it didn't come in February. But the point I really do want to emphasize that despite that, I've been personally bird dogging this issue since we got that language in the report, in the defense bill, knowing that sometimes the department's reluctant to do exactly what we say. But General Cartwright, vice chief, is responsible for pushing this stuff through, and I was on the phone with him yesterday to talk about it in anticipation of today's meeting. And I've met with him several times and had several phone calls, and let him know that this is something that there are enough of us interested, and he knows that, and it's not trying to put pressure on the general or anything at all like that. He knows that, but he also needs to know that there are people interested in Congress as well. He needs to know that if he's doing this, there's going to be some level of good response to what he is pushing in the department. And so that's part of that relationship that needs to continue as well. So, they've done the CBA, capabilities-based assessment, the functional skills analysis work, and they're looking at, the challenge is looking at the organization of the department and how to really organize it and reorganize it with regards to spectrum, with regards to information operations overall, and not just in terms of how spectrum is used, but who uses it, when is it used, which services use it, what's the investment strategy and the acquisition strategy, and all this is important work because it needs to be done because it's being done well, but it is being done inefficiently. And there's just still a lot of services doing their own thing, and all the services need to do their own thing, but it needs to be coordinated. And we don't, unfortunately, we're learning the lesson. We don't coordinate it until we're actually in the battlefield. And then we have to learn how to do it. Well, all that, if we move all that upstairs for a while, we might actually find out we can develop an investment strategy that's better, and an acquisition strategy that's better, a management and operations, readiness strategy that's better. So that's been my message to the DoD, and so far so good. Even though technically they haven't responded to the report, I don't want to get too bent out of shape about that if they're doing the things that personally I think they ought to be doing, or it ought to be doing. We all, Congress and them, right? The services and DoD.
Okay, let's have the last question back there.
Congressman, hello, from a different uniform.
Yeah,
just
right.
retired. I'm also president-elect of the AOC now.
Oh, you did?
So
Congratulations.
looking forward to working with you some more in the future. Lori Buckout. We've been looking at some of the successes that cyber has had over the last few years. There is the definition that came out a couple years back of cyberspace as its own domain. And as everybody knows, words mean something there. And when that began to happen, it began to get funding, it began to get leadership, it began to get more definitions leading into it, its own battle space, so to say, and that sort of led to a lot. What do you think about the concept of the spectrum as its own domain? Do you think that would be advantageous to the community? Would it bring the sort of things that it seemed to have brought to the cyberspace concept?
I think it would, but I would also think that in looking at the broader issue of information operations, where the DoD seems to be headed, that a lot of this is sort of cyber is part of that, spectrum is part of that, some other things that are part of that, and and putting a name to it will help. If putting a name to it, so I would say that cyber is getting a lot of attention because if the president's talking about it, or if the secretary's talking about it, then I know a lot of the folks in uniform start thinking about it. A lot of the folks in the academic community and the industry start thinking about it too. And so I think it might be more important about who says the word as opposed to what the word is. What I've been trying to do is to continually beat that drum about we need to be talking, we need to be saying these words at the highest levels, so the attention is paid and people say, yeah, we may want to be a part of that. So you call it spectrum, call it what you want. It's a matter of trying to make sure the leadership is there, saying it's important to do, organizing it so it's important across the services, within OSD and then therefore across the services. So the investment, the acquisition strategy, the training strategy. Great job, by the way, in the Army. So all of that is being driven by the leadership in the country. That's how I would put it. Yeah.
Okay, Congressman, thank you so much for your time this morning. We
Thanks
very
a
much
lot.
appreciate you coming.